Es paciente y pleno de bondad. Él nunca dejará de existir. Para siempre nos ayuda a vivir en hermandad. El amor es eterno. Y es así porque Dios es amor. El amor nunca piensa solo para sí. Se afirma siempre en la verdad. Perdona y nunca guarda rencor, todo comprende. El amor verdadero es así porque Dios es amor. Gracias. Este es el día, este es el día, este es el día que hizo el Señor. Ábrame las puertas de la justicia, entraré para alabarle al Señor. Esta es la puerta que Dios nos ha dado, todos los justos por él entrarán. Este es el día, este es el día, este es el día que hizo el Señor. Voy a alabarte porque me has oído y porque fuiste mi gran salvación. Esta es la piedra que fue mi desejada, ha vuelto ahora hacia el fundamental. Este es el día, este es el día, este es el día que hizo el Señor. Es el Señor quien ha hecho todo esto. Qué maravilla poder verlo hoy. Este es el día que el Señor ha hecho. Con alegría la vemos en él. Este es el día, este es el día, este es el día que hizo el Señor. Oh, bajo tu ala tutelar seremos en el bien, alondras que para anidar la misma rama bien, la flecha que nos da dolor no parte del devote amor. Si tu palabra acto cruel la caña destrozó, pide al Señor el don de aquel que al hombre amó y sanó. Procura tú en el bien pensar que a todos une en el amor. La vara del saber cabal es don que dale fe y hay un mensaje celestial que en gloria y luz se ve. Lo manda el cercano amor que humilla y orgullo y temor. Dios hizo con su voz nacer de sol la creación. Sea la luz y fue la luz que nubes disipó. Amor que traza y feraz, promesa eres fiel de paz. Tú que esperanza a todos das, nos libras del rancor. Tu amor la vida es en verdad, pues vida es solo amor. Muy dulce vida se alaba, lo hacemos siempre con bondad. El cielo canta alegría, aleluya, porque en tu vida y la mía brilla la gloria de Dios. Aleluya, 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 aleluya. El cielo canta alegría, aleluya, porque en tu vida y la mía son la expresión del amor. Aleluya, 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 aleluya. El cielo canta alegría, aleluya, porque en tu vida y la mía son para gloria de Dios. Aleluya, 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 aleluya. Tem vida que estará consagrada a ti, Senhor. Tem mis dias que se irão solo en tu eterna flor. Tem mis manos que obrarán al impulso de tu amor. Tem mis pies que estarán siempre prontos para ti. Tem mi voz que cantará siempre y solo a ti, Señor. Tem mis labios que serán mensajeros de tu amor. Tem del todo mi pensar, lo que escojas haz con él. de mi amor que rendirá sus tesoros a tus pies. De mi vida que estará consagrada a ti, Señor. Tuyo soy y siempre igual, tuyo solo habré de ser. Muchas gracias.
Good evening, and welcome to our free lecture titled Making Right Decisions. We have the pleasure of welcoming Leide Lessa, Christian Science practitioner and member of the Christian Science Board of Lectureship. Leide worked for 14 years at the Christian Science Publishing Society. The last 6 as managing editor of the Herald of Christian Science, and published regularly in 14 languages. During the 10 years that Leide owned her language institute, she participated in national and international teachers' conferences. She also helped organize local Christian Science youth summits. After witnessing healings from students and colleagues,
para su vida era el ayudar
she felt that there is no higher
al prójimo
profession
por medio de la curación científica
dedicating her
metafísica.
life to helping others
Y
through metaphysical
a partir de
scientific
1998 se dedicó por
So she
tiempo
sold her
completo
school and became a
a,
Christian Science
a
practitioner
la oración
in
metafísica y
1998,
científica.
and a Christian Science teacher.
En el 2009 se graduó como maestra de la ciencia cristiana. En Boston, Leide fue la redactora de las ediciones de la revista de El Heraldo de la Ciencia Cristiana en 14 idiomas. También trabajó para el Comité de Publicaciones de la Ciencia Cristiana y en este momento trabaja para el Departamento de Actividades de la Iglesia. Leide vive en Massachusetts, en Quincy, y da conferencias en español, alemán, inglés y portugués. Espero ustedes disfruten de esta conferencia, tomar decisiones correctas. Muchas gracias. Y aquí está Leide.
Making right decisions.
Muchas gracias. Buenas noches.
Good evening.
Qué gusto estar con ustedes todos aquí.
It's a
Muy
pleasure to be
bienvenidos.
here with you. Welcome
Bueno,
to everyone.
es tomar decisiones correctas. Es quizás un tema
Making right
importante.
decisions is a very important theme.
Y bueno, es tomar decisiones un tema importante. Vamos a ver, no está funcionando.
We have a few slides here that I'm going to show to you tonight. About
Can
this
somebody help?
important
It's not working.
Topic. First, let's just get
Sorry for that.
the slides
Perdón,
straight.
perdón. Vamos a ver.
Just a second. We're going to see.
We
share
tested
what the
before.
slides.
Hemos testado antes, pero vamos a ver qué es lo que pasa. Ahora sí, ahora sí.
Okay, now we're
Okay.
ready.
Bueno, si uno busca entonces tomar decisiones correctas, uno va a encontrar más de 400
Online or on Google, you will find more than 400 million searches and results. Why is this such an important and popular topic? Well, there's studies that tell us that each one of us has more than 60,000 thoughts per day. That means that we have thousands of thoughts without even realizing it. What should we eat? What should we drink? Which news should we watch on TV? But the real question is, what should we do to take or make right decisions that are the most important decisions in our life? What kind of career should I choose? Where should I live? And most important of all, how should I take care of my health? Making right decisions is also a topic that has to do with others, because our decisions also affect the lives of thousands of others that we come into contact with every day. Making right decisions is also connected to our mental, emotional, and physical health. But what's the basis? What's the source of the ability to make a decision that is correct and right? I'd like you to think about, imagine a young woman who had been living abroad for 4 years. I'm going to share an example with you. And this young woman had to make a big decision. She had to go back to her home country for family reasons. She had to return to the country where she grew up, even though she was living far away. This was an important decision for her and also for her family. At this moment, she was in the process of changing her visa status in her new country, and she would need a special authorization to return home. So she researched it, talked with a lawyer who told her she would just need 1 week to request the authorization in person. So, when she was told it was easy to take this authorization, to receive the authorization, she went to the federal office where she was informed that the procedure had recently changed. An authorization request was needed to be asked by mail only, not in person, and she needed to do it from another state. This was a huge surprise, and she didn't know what to do. Should she return and possibly lose her chance of gaining a visa and all that she'd worked for? Or should she stay and leave her family behind? So she prayed about it. She had always relied on God to make decisions. And this time when she prayed, she closed her eyes and focused, and she heard a soft voice. And the voice came with a gentle thought. It said, "You're a citizen of the world. Accept your freedom. Accept your liberty. God doesn't create borders or countries and doesn't know borders. God loves each one of us equally. And right now, divine love proves there are no red tapes, no bureaucracy." At that moment, she decided she would return home. She felt she needed to concentrate and recognize that divine laws are always fair, and that divine love was governing the situation. And after she took this decision, she was able to travel freely home, knowing that she would be able to go back to that country, and that what would develop would be right in God's will. And that's exactly what happened. She had to stay for a little extra while, but there was a legal way for her to return home safely and with no interruptions in her work or her visa process. So this story gives you an idea of what we'll be discussing today. Making right decisions bring real and lasting solutions. Decisions that do not depend on human reasoning nor on the brain, but rather depend on our ability to listen and to yield to a higher power, yield to a divine will. We're going to be talking about the truths of how we can depend on our own innate ability to listen and yield to this higher power. We'll also be talking about the Bible and some concepts that come from the Bible. The Bible speaks to us about divine mind, a mind that does not have a body, that's connected to the concept and the idea of infinite love, love without limits, and unconditional love. I like to think about God in these terms. Just like Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science, chose these two words, these two synonyms, these two phrases that are synonyms for God. And this is my favorite way of understanding the concept of God. In her book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, Mary Baker Eddy shared these two concepts. She spoke about a love that embraced everyone. And as it embraced them and enveloped them, it opened the minds of every single person on earth. So, thinking about the audience that we have here today, there's probably many of you who know Christian Science, but there's also people here that might never have heard of Christian Science or might only have Googled it. There's also people listening online that may or may not be familiar with Christian Science. But I want to ask you, the people that are here, how would you define Christian Science? Oh, great. Yes, something that you can find evidence of, something that you can prove. If we look in the dictionary, science is defined as a method reconciling practical ends with scientific laws. If we think about scientific laws and how they relate to spiritual laws and how they relate to something that can be proved, that can give results, then we're thinking about something that's called Christian Science. Christian Science is something that we know is based on the teachings of Christ Jesus. Mary Baker Eddy says something very beautiful about this. She says that Christian Science is the highest form of thought expressed here by man. By following the teachings of Jesus, we have the power of understanding and healing any feeling, any emotion of helplessness, any feeling of not being able to overcome any evil. That is what the heart of Christian Science and Christian Science healing is about. Tonight we're going to talk a little bit about the recent tragic events in El Paso, Texas, the mass shootings, as well as other tragic events and world events that may appear to be a helpless situation or make us feel helpless. But we're going to look at them through the lens of Christian Science, through the lens of healing. And as you said earlier, we're going to look at how to prove that this Christian Science does have proven results. I'm going to talk now about this book, Science and Health by Mary Baker Eddy, with Key to the Scriptures. This is the book that explains the principle of the science of Christian Science. It's an understanding, it offers us an understanding that's not based on the limits of human mind. It's a metaphysical interpretation of the Bible and of the world. It goes beyond physics. Through this book and its message, we can yield to the understanding of what the Bible calls a still, small voice. Maybe some of you have heard the story of Elias. Elias, there's a story in the Bible of Elias who went to Mount Horeb and there heard a still small voice. Well, let's talk about this story a little bit more. Elijah was a man who did some things that were not good, that were against humanity, and that had very negative results on the people and communities of his time. But at the same time, Elijah had a desire to change, and also a desire, as we do, as many of us do here in the audience, to understand and to see God, to have an experience in which he would feel the presence of God and know what to do. So he went up to the mountain, to Mount Horeb, and there Elijah looked out into the expanse and saw mountains and wind and nature. And then he saw a huge gust of wind. And followed by the gust of wind, he felt an earthquake and a great shaking of the mountain. But he understood that God was not in the wind, and he was also not in the earthquake. Followed by the earthquake, there was a horrible fire that Elijah saw from the mountain. Perhaps it was like the fires that we saw recently in the news that destroyed a big part of California here in the United States. Perhaps Elijah saw something to this extent. But he also understood that God was not in the fire, just as he was not in the earthquake nor in the wind. And at that moment, Elijah heard a still small voice. And in that voice, he felt the presence of God and knew what to do. And he knew then exactly what he felt and what his next steps should be. This is the still small voice that I was speaking about before. And I want us to think a little bit more deeply about this. It was a divine utterance that came directly from God and came directly to Elijah's heart. And today we can hear the same still small voice that comes directly to our heart. It can guide us to make right decisions related to our physical, emotional, and mental health, as well as to other aspects of our life. I love to remind myself of this still small voice. How else might we be able to identify this still small voice in our daily lives? One translation describes it as a gentle whisper. Another says it's like a soft breathing. Another like a soft exhale. All of these definitions have a few things in common. They give us the feeling of something that's calm and gentle, something that's full of peace. So, in our daily life, what do we need to hear this voice? Yes, that's correct. Exactly. Silence. Sometimes there's so much noise going on around us. So many people saying things, negative things, so many negative things in the news. Thinking about immigration, we see all these problems with people leaving tragedies in their homelands, coming to a new homeland, coming to the United States. There's a lot of movement, a lot of busyness out there if we look at the news, and sometimes that comes and clouds our own thoughts. But if we think about and take that one theme from the news, immigration, what if the still small voice can help us find a solution to help those hundreds of people who are seeking peace, seeking refuge? Thinking more about this, what else do we need to hear that still small voice and its healing message? Love. We need to love, that's right. We need to love in order to hear that voice. And we need to love unconditionally. We need to be able to love our fellow man regardless of skin color, regardless of height, regardless of looks. That's what loving unconditionally is about. And through that kind of love, we can reach a kind of purity. It's a spiritual purity that allows us to see God the way Elijah saw God on Mount Horeb. I don't know if anyone here has done this before, but sometimes we say, okay, God, I would like this, this, and this to happen. And we ask God to fulfill our petitions. But when we come with a different approach to our prayers, when we're humble, and when we ask God, what can I do to make a better change? What can I do to be more patient? What can I do to express more love? What can I do to express compassion? Then our prayer takes on a much different feeling. And that's exactly when we can be able to listen to a voice that's not human, a voice that's a manifestation of divine mind. And that's the still small voice that I was talking about. This is the same voice that came to Jesus, that came to prophets in the Bible. And this voice also came to Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science. She studied the Bible, and she studied it so closely that she found the true essence of the Bible and the true essence that God is good. That with this concept of God as a good God, there is no revenge, there is no feeling of helplessness, and there's no concept of an angry God that people from other centuries had once believed in. So for me, this is one of the central points of understanding Christian Science and of practicing Christian Science. It's understanding the true essence of God as good. So some of you might be thinking, how can I understand this kind of science? How can I really understand it? So the first thing I'd say to that is the thing that we need to develop to understand this kind of Christian science is our spiritual sense. This spiritual sense allows us to see beyond what our human eyes, our limited sense of human sight can see. This spiritual sense is exactly what allows us to hear the still small voice. I'd like to ask you now if for a volunteer from the audience to lead this phrase for everybody. We have a couple mics over here and over there. Do we have a volunteer? Thank you very much. Developing your spiritual sense, conscious, constant capacity to understand God. Perfect, thank you. So if we think about this consciousness, this constant consciousness that understands God, when do we have this? When are we conscious? When we're sleeping? Okay, right, when we're awake, when we're alert. If this capacity and this skill is constant for us to be conscious, is it something that we can have only in the future or once in a while? No. This is something that we have access to every single moment of our lives. It's our own access to understanding God and God's role and the role of divine mind in our lives and in the planning of our futures. So each one of us has the ability to develop this spiritual sense. And Mary Baker Eddy speaks a lot about this in Science and Health. When we develop this spiritual sense is when we're really able to perceive and understand God and God's creation. That's when we can truly understand that God is spirituality and God is love. And we can understand God's creation based on spirituality and based on divine love. And by the same way, we understand that divine love and divine mind are present in every single example of God's creation on this earth. So this spiritual understanding is a way for us to perceive the gentle whisper that is constantly there, that never disappears and that is always speaking to us and appealing to our spiritual selves and our spiritual sense. Okay, the microphone is working. Oh, we're going to change the microphone. Please bear with us while we change the microphone. In a few minutes, we'll resolve these technical difficulties. She was asking if the translation was right. Yeah, give her a thumbs up. But she can't see me. Yes. Okay. And we're up.
Ahora sí, vamos a
Okay,
seguir.
we're
Muy
back.
bien, excelente.
Excellent.
que é? Somos 3 brasileiros. There are 3 Brazilians here.
Okay.
Oh, e vocês também? Que ótimo. So we are 5 Brazilians. Wonderful. Thank you for coming.
Power that I have to work around. Probably this works.
Okay, she's asking if the translation's working.
Yes.
No, it's not working. So can I do it a little bit bilingual then? I can speak both. Yes? Okay. So when it starts, if
Someone needs
okay. So vamos a ver. If it starts working, you tell me, and I will speak only Spanish. Okay? Thank you very much. So when physical sense says, okay, I see a rainbow, I see some green, I see some waterfalls, but spiritual sense enables you to see beyond the picture. So especially now, we need to develop our spiritual sense. Spiritual sense, Mary Baker defines the spiritual sense in a way that I feel it's very important. I would like another volunteer, please. Could someone read this for us? Me gustaría un voluntario, por favor. Oh, sí, por favor, ¿podría leer usted? Ella va a leer para nosotros aquí en español y ustedes tienen ahí en inglés. So she was going to read for us in Spanish and you can follow it. Por favor, en español. ¿No está funcionando? No funciona. ¿Este tampoco funciona? Ok, perdón. Entonces, no hay problema. Entonces digo yo. Ok. Gracias, sí, gracias. Mary Baker dice, si el sentido espiritual
Mary Baker Eddy says, if spiritual sense always guides men, there would grow out of ecstatic moments a higher experience and a better life with more devout self-abnegation and purity.
Spiritual sense always guided men. There would grow out of ecstatic moments a higher experience and a better life with more devout self-abnegation and purity. Yo creo que todos ustedes aquí se dan cuenta que Mary Baker Eddy está diciendo que el sentido espiritual puede traer una vida mejor.
I think everyone
All
can
of you
tell
can just realize that Mary Baker Eddy is saying here, okay, spiritual sense can give us a better life. But what is a better life? ¿Qué es una vida mejor? ¿Es una vida con más dinero? ¿Una vida con mucha plata? ¿Es esa una vida mejor? No. Es una vida con paz. Es una vida con amor. Es una vida con tranquilidad. Una vida con salud. Una vida con entendimiento, con comprensión espiritual.
spiritual
Pero para
sense
obtener eso, ella también dice que tenemos que
is
tener
about having a life
abnegación más devota y pureza. But she also says here,
or living a life that's unselfish
back once again.
and pure.
She also says here that we need to have a more devout self-abnegation and purity. What is that? ¿Qué es eso? Una abnegación más devota y pureza. Isn't that old-fashioned? ¿Eso no es algo anticuado? ¿Qué quiere decir eso? ¿Qué creen ustedes? Es una pregunta. So it's a real question. ¿Qué puede ser abnegación más devota? Ajá, ok. Orar, adorar, tener una... Ok, tener humildad.
So we're talking about self-abnegation. What's the meaning of self-abnegation? And we have an idea from the audience.
Miramos aquí en inglés. Está la palabra self-abnegation. Self es algo que es de persona, ¿verdad?
So if we examine the word up here, it's self-abnegation, not just abnegation. Self meaning something to do with ourselves.
Devota puede ser quitar el yo. It can be really put self aside. Not thinking so much about being egocentric or egoistic, but really being unselfish and loving everyone equally. Quizás no tanto pensar en tener, en ser
Perhaps it's not about
centro del
trying,
ego, pensar mucho
or
en
the ego trying to be
pensar en todos. Y por
in
eso,
charge of
por eso es tan
everything. It's
importante
not about the
que Holy
ego
Spirit is so important.
leading our lives, but it's about something more altruistic.
Oh, is this working? Okay. La traducción, the translation is
Okay,
working?
translation is
Okay,
up and
great.
running.
Thank you. So, entonces la pureza. ¿Por qué es la pureza?
So if we go back to this idea of purity and how this relates to self-abnegation.
It's working. You can listen to the translation. Thank you. Thank you very much. Entonces, quizás ustedes se acuerdan.
So maybe you remember that one of the Beatitudes says,
Bendecido o bienaventurado, que también quiere decir en la lengua moderna feliz. Entonces vamos a pensar.
the blessed,
Es aquel de corazón
the concept of the blessed, which also means the happy, the joyful.
ver a Dios.
Blessed are the joyful because they can see God.
Ver a Dios no como cosa humana,
Just like Elijah saw God,
presencia de Dios.
just like Elijah felt the presence of God and felt the omnipotent presence of God, this is how we can experience God through self-abnegation and through the purity that comes with it, that comes with letting God lead instead of the ego lead.
Tener una vida mejor, pero esta vida mejor nos ayuda a ser más altruistas
So this spiritual sense allows us to have a better life, but it's a better life
y para saber.
that's altruistic, that's not selfish,
Mary Baker Eddy también dice
and at the same time allows us to forgive both ourselves and others.
de ella que me encanta.
I want to share another quote from Mary Baker Eddy that I love.
Ciencia humana
She says, spiritual sense lifts human consciousness into eternal truth. Don't you think that now, in this world, especially after the tragic events of El Paso, that we need a spiritual sense, a collective spiritual sense, that brings us to a higher sense of good, a higher sense of God?
y
that we are a part of. A spiritual sense that shows us that we are a part of this God that is good, regardless of our physical appearance, regardless of our background or our race. The spiritual sense also allows us to understand that this hatred that we see expressed will not triumph over us. That this hatred can never triumph over good and has never triumphed over the good of God, even in historic times. This understanding helps us to see that goodness is omnipotent, omnipresent. So if we look to the Bible doesn't tell us a lot about Jesus when he was a child, but it does tell us that he grew up with wisdom and with grace. And it tells us a lot about Jesus' teachings when he became an adult. As an adult, Jesus taught this divine wisdom that came directly from divine mind. And Jesus also taught about grace. How can we define grace? What is grace? Grace can be a blessing. That's another synonym. Anything else? Humility. Grace can also be humility. Yes? Sorry, what was that? A pleasant attitude. When we have an attitude that is full of peace and calmness. We can also think about when we develop grace, this quality of grace. That means we are able to be more sensitive to hear the still small voice that we spoke about earlier. So if we return back to the Old Testament that Jesus learned and studied and thought about very deeply, this Old Testament really influenced and was the basis of Christianity. And because of this, because of these teachings, Jesus was known as Rabbi or Master. But even more than that, he was the Messiah. The Messiah is a word that comes from Hebrew and is also a synonym of Christ. And at its heart, it means the chosen one. The one that was chosen to be the Savior. And those of us who are Brazilian remember this term, the Redeemer. In Brazil, we think of Jesus as the Redeemer. And this idea of Jesus as the Redeemer, as the spiritual sense, the spiritual heart of the world, also demonstrates how his message embraced all of us. Jesus did things to express his love for God that seemed humanly impossible today in our world. He healed, he forgave. He did things like multiplied loaves and fishes. He asked disciples like Peter to fish and who found a coin in the mouth of a fish. And in those times, maybe this made sense at first because Peter was a fisherman, but later it did seem very strange when Jesus asked Peter, the fisherman, to find a coin in the mouth of the fish in order to pay his taxes. And the results of those, the reason for paying the taxes was to have a beautiful city and a beautiful town and contribute to the community. But how exactly was this possible? How was it possible to find a coin in the mouth of a fish and turn that coin into something that helped the whole town? I don't think that Jesus was speaking literally. If we look for a more symbolic meaning of this story, Jesus was also talking about the ability of Peter to develop his spiritual sense and his faith as well. Sometimes we have this feeling, a great feeling of loss, of helplessness, perhaps as Peter might have felt at that time. But through spiritual understanding, we learn to see that there actually is no suffering, there is no loss, there is no helplessness. And that feeling of great loss can leave just as quickly as it comes in. With this spiritual understanding, it can enlighten us to know exactly what's needed. Maybe what's needed is to forgive others or to forgive ourselves. Whatever it is, it's something that through the spiritual understanding, we can learn to see what the next steps are. Do we have another microphone? I was going to ask someone else to lead. Okay, I will lead. I will read this phrase out loud. It's something that Mary Baker Eddy wrote. She said, like our Master, we must depart from material sense into the spiritual sense of being. And why is this important? So just like our Master, our teacher told us, who's our teacher? Jesus. He told us we must depart from material sense. Why? Because material sense tells us that we can't do something. It tells us it's very difficult. Material sense says there's only hatred surrounding us. It surrounds us in the news, it surrounds us in our country. But when we leave that material sense, we turn away from the material to a spiritual sense of being. And that spiritual sense tells us exactly the opposite. The spiritual sense helps us feel protected. It shows us the true nature of our fellow man and the true events that happen around us in our country, in our towns, in our cities. Going back to Mary Baker Eddy, how did she come to this understanding of a spiritual sense? Well, she spent a lot of her time reading. She also spent a lot of her time writing, studying the Bible. She had a brother who taught her other languages. Her brother Albert taught her a little bit of Greek, a little bit of Latin, and taught her about other cultures as well, and helped her open her mind to understand some of what was going on in her world at that time. But something that Mary Baker Eddy told us that she learned after all of these teachings that was even more important than listening to other cultures or things going on in the world was the idea that she could listen to God. And through that listening to God, she heard very clearly the good that was present in all life. And she also listened and heard a message of love, a love that triumphed over all hatred, a love that triumphed over all tragedy in life. And Mary Baker Eddy also had a number of healings in her own life that she was able to demonstrate. Before Christian Science, she tried out many different ways of healing, like homeopathy, that were available in her time. But none of these cured her, and also none of them satisfied her search for truth. Her whole life, she was looking for a scientific method that would help her learn and listen and live her life in a way that was directed divinely by God, who she understood to be divine love. We could say she was on a quest to find a divine method of healing that she needed in her life and that she saw needed around her. And this kind of divine healing also brought comfort. It brought solutions. And it dissolved the feeling It dissolved the feeling of helplessness, of loss, that she saw also around her during her time.
y no sentimos muerte, superamos el sentido de muerte para vivir ahora mismo la vida que es eterna.
She even found in this truth a way to overcome the feeling of death and death's triumph in this life.
Génesis 1, la Biblia habla que el hombre es hecho a imagen
So going back to the Bible, the main source of Mary Baker Eddy's study, what does the Bible say about the nature of man?
¿Cómo hemos pensado que el hombre, que Dios es amor y Dios es mente, que Dios
The Bible tells us
es espíritu,
that
o sea,
God
es materia?
is completely spiritual, that God is love, and that we are a reflection of this spiritual idea. If God doesn't have a body, how can we, as God's image and likeness, have a body? Let's take a closer look at this and see how Mary Baker Eddy understood it.
Como vuestro Padre que está en el cielo es perfecto. Pero es una
Mary Baker Eddy saw that the Bible teaches that we are perfect just as God, our Father in heaven, is perfect. Perfect and spiritual, and a reflection of the divine.
Cuando ustedes quieren ver su imagen,
But let's look closer at this idea of the image. What's meant when we read about the image and likeness of God?
entonces,
Here's a very practical example.
gustaría que ustedes, por
I have here a mirror.
ustedes miraran al
I'd
espejo,
like to ask
que
you
ustedes utilizaran el sentido espiritual,
to do an exercise,
ustedes puedan ver a
a
ustedes
spiritual
más
exercise,
allá de que,
that will help you see
que una imagen.
beyond the image that we see in the mirror.
Y ustedes
I'm
pueden
going to give you an
orar,
example.
ustedes pueden orar por ustedes mismos. Yo voy a pedir aquí a mi amigo William.
I'm going to ask my friend William to hold this mirror.
Ok. ¿El otro lado? Ok, puedes ir al otro lado.
William, can you come over to the other side?
Hola, hola.
Ahora sí.
Okay, now the microphone's working.
Soy
Perfect.
paciente, amoroso y puedo amar porque reflejo el amor divino.
William is reading, I'm patient, loving, and lovable because I reflect divine love.
Tomar decisiones correctas.
I'm intelligent, wise, and capable of making right decisions because I reflect divine mind and am able to listen to mind's direction. Thank you, William. Perfect.
Oraciones.
These are two phrases. They're very simple. But every time, if you think of this phrase, every time you look at yourself in the mirror, you can use this phrase to understand yourself not through a physical body, but through spiritual qualities. These can help you to see that you are made completely of spiritual ideas.
Lo original es el amor divino. El amor divino
These can help us to realize the original idea of divine love. This is the origin of God and of God's image,
nosotros entendemos que la mente
meaning us.
divina es el original. Ustedes pueden pensar
If we know that God and the original image is divine love, and that's something we want to express more in our lives,
parte de la frase porque refleja
then let's look at the second part of this phrase.
el amor divino porque
I reflect divine mind and am able to listen to mind's direction because I reflect divine love.
yo soy capaz de perdonar
By saying this and praying with this idea, what we're saying to ourselves is that we are capable of forgiving. For example, I'm capable of forgiving the people who, or the person who caused the tragic shootings in El Paso, Texas. I'm capable of also loving my fellow man and fellow people, regardless of race or where they're from or background. And I can do this because I'm aware of my true origin as a reflection of divine love. I'm a reflection of the source of divine love. Another example that can help us is the ID card. Who has their ID card here?
lo que dice la identidad.
What does an ID card say?
El nombre, ¿qué más?
It has the name, our name listed,
La dirección,
our address, what else?
fecha de nacimiento. Muy bien.
And our birth date.
En estas tres cosas.
Okay, let's think about these three things.
Cada vez que ustedes
Let's think about them as an
identidad,
an
me gustaría
analogy.
que ustedes, por favor, pensaran
I'd like you to think about
espiritual.
every time you look at your ID, what if you thought about not just your physical identity, but your spiritual identity?
Que Abraham cambió su nombre para Abraham. ¿Ustedes se acuerdan que
Do you remember the story of Abraham?
Israel y
He had changed his name from Abram to Abraham.
Pablo?
Saul changed his name to Paul.
¿Por qué cambió?
Why did we see these name changes, these identity changes in the Bible? Did something happen inside them?
Su perspectiva. Empezaron a
Yes, something happened because they themselves changed their own identity by starting to see themselves spiritually, and that caused an internal change. If we take this example, think of your own name now, and think about your own natural identity, your own origin. Who are you? You're a person that's capable of loving, you're a person that's capable of forgiveness, and you're a person that reflects the image of divine love. So spiritually speaking, we actually were never born and we will never die. Spiritually, we always exist and we always have exist with divine mind. For this reason, there's no death, there are no limits and no hatred. This concept allows us to pray and understand and unite with the people who are suffering in El Paso, the people who are suffering in Ohio. If we think that all people coexist with divine love and divine mind, we exist together without separation in this sphere of love. So what's our spiritual address? Okay, the kingdom of heaven, that's right. Spiritually speaking, it doesn't matter where we're from, if we're from Mexico or from Brazil, Boston, South America, Central America. It doesn't matter where we're from. It doesn't matter where we've been, where we're going, or where we are right now. If we understand that we always live in the kingdom of heaven, in a state of consciousness that's good, that's pure, and that is always harmonious, that's full of health and love. So in this way, Christian Science teaches us how to see ourselves spiritually. When you start to develop your spiritual sense and you're not sure what to do or where to turn, or you feel doubt or fear, remember that your spiritual essence comes from God, and that you can refuse any thoughts that don't go in accordance with divine love. You can refuse any thoughts of hatred, of principles that go against ethics. You can refuse even the idea that one person could murder or hurt many other people. We don't have to accept acts like this. When we see examples like this, it's important to understand that sometimes people in our world grow far from this idea of God and from their spiritual origin, and they get lost. And that's when things like this, the tragic events that we've seen recently, can occur. But it doesn't mean they can't return and find themselves and find the spirituality that we can choose to reflect in our own lives every single day. I also want to share a few phrases with you and invite you to do the exercise with the mirror, to recognize your true spirituality, your spiritual identity, to think about your true ID card. So God gave us dominion. What is dominion? Dominion is to rule and have ultimate authority over every thought and every action. This is a natural right of God, to refuse bad thoughts, to refuse hatred, hateful thoughts, to refuse hopelessness. God has this kind of dominion over thought, over the world, and over divine mind that governs all. Mary Baker Eddy understood this concept of dominion. She understood her spiritual self. and she understood spiritual existence. She herself demonstrated the spiritual existence with healings in her own life. She had a chronic indigestion problem, and she also cured others and cured her students of similar healings. In this book on page 184, she speaks about an immediate healing of tuberculosis from one of her patients. And she continues to tell us about the healings that she held through more than 40 years. There's also a couple biographies that I wanted to mention about Mary Baker Eddy that tell these stories. Mary Baker Eddy, Christian healer, tells of over 100 healings in her lifetime that she completed and that she brought to many different communities around the world. And in this book and through these healings, if we read them, we're able to understand how Mary Baker Eddy was a person full of love, a person who dedicated her whole life to helping others. As a little child, she grew up in New England. It was very cold. Even as a very young being, her family would tell of how she would come home from school without gloves or mittens because she'd given them to other children who were cold or didn't have enough to purchase warm clothing. So from a child through her whole adult life, she dedicated herself to helping others, and the way she discovered her true purpose in life and the way she could help others the most was through her discovery of Christian metaphysics. So this is a spiritual system of healing that's practical, that helps us understand exactly how to heal and how to help others in a way that's real and practical in our own lives. And she spoke and told us how to apply this science in our own existence and in our own health, in the mental health and the physical health that each one of us experiences in our lifetime. And at the heart of her teachings and understanding this scientific system of healing is the idea that to heal, we must express love. And that is the true grain and heart of healing. In order to express love that heals, we also need to pray and hear directly from that still small voice that the Bible mentions. In my own life, I have dedicated myself a few years ago to becoming a Christian Science practitioner, where I follow Mary Baker Eddy's footsteps and help others who need spiritual support through prayer and who need to find their spiritual sense through prayer. I wanted to share with you an example from my healing practice. A while ago, I received a call in the middle of the night, and it was a woman who was in her last month of pregnancy. Her baby had not moved for a week, and she and her husband decided to have a medical checkup. And she called me on the way to the hospital. At that moment, I knew that we had to make a decision. We needed to turn to God as the only life, and to see God's creation as an expression of life. And in my prayers, I needed to see that an idea cannot be separated from the origin. So I asked her to call me every half an hour, and or her mother, who was with her, to call me on her behalf, as I held closely to the reality of divine eternal life. Well, she arrived at the hospital, and the doctor gave her an immediate cesarean. After some birth and some procedures, the doctor reported that the baby girl would not survive. But at that moment, we decided we will not give up. We prayed to have a better understanding that God is the only life. And we prayed to know that the baby was a pure expression of divine life. we said, we're not going to give up. Her mother and me and the woman united our thoughts in realizing that this expression of life present in her baby was an expression that was eternal. There's no beginning, there is no end. There's only the reflection of divine mind and divine love. So we prayed, opening ourselves completely to this understanding, to God's direction. We never said to God, okay, please do this and that and this, take these steps. No, we opened up our lives and said, God, this life is your life. We were able to leave our fears aside. The baby was not receiving any medical treatment at this point. But we were calm. And little by little, the child became better and better and better. And the baby survived. And in 10 days, the mom and the baby were able to go home, completely healed. And a year later, there was a gathering at the same hospital. And when the doctor saw the girl in her mother's arm, he said, "Oh, the miracle baby." And he could not medically explain how she had survived. But we understood that through our prayer and our spiritual sense, this baby had continued to live and continued to be the reflection of divine love, perfect in every way. And we understood together in this moment that life was eternal and we could never be separated from this deep concept of God. And today, she's a beautiful and healthy 9-year-old girl. 9-year-old girl. But this kind of example of life and of healing is not what we're accustomed to see every day in the news. We see just the opposite. We see suffering. We see people losing their faith. We see destruction of our environment and our mental health, of our culture and our country. And that's why we must hold fast to this concept that love will and can and always has triumphed over the material sense. Love is what is able to get rid of every reflection or sense or idea of error. And this is something that we can apply in any area of our lives. I want to invite you to think about the concepts and continue thinking about the concepts we've discussed tonight, to meditate on them, to ponder and pray, especially whenever you feel anxiety or fear. Continue praying. Pray without ceasing, as Mary Baker Eddy tells us to do. And this will help us gain inner peace. It will help us to live according to moral values and ethical values that we hold dear. This same understanding will help us to love our neighbors, the newcomers to our country, the people who have been here for many generations. And if we see in the news or in our everyday lives, if we see examples of people doing bad things, let's remember Christ, the manifestation of God, that guides us, that transforms us, that regenerates and loves us. And when we do this, we can also recognize and understand that we can return to this understanding of the divine at any moment in our lives. And returning to the spirituality will show us which steps to take to make correct decisions, to make good decisions in our lives. I think everyone here today wants a society that is more just, that is more honest, more full of love. Where does that kind of society start? Does it start with other people? Out in the news? It starts within us. If we want a society that is more full of peace, more tranquil, less full of anxiety, we can start by first examining our decisions that we make in our everyday life and moving them away from the egotistical decisions and towards decisions inspired by love. And we can do this without pointing fingers, without saying you're wrong or you're right, or telling God what to do for us. We can do this by returning to divine love that guides us with every single decision we make in life. I want to give you another example. Recently in the news, we also see that there's cultural stereotypes. For example, about Latin Americans and Latinos in the United States, that Latinos are loud or bad or bring crime or negative things to our society. Well, I'm going to give you an example of when I was a young woman. I was 21 years old and I lived in London. And I had a lot of friends, and I was hanging out one evening with a group of Latin American friends when one of our friends, took out a cigarette of marijuana and passed it to the next person and smoked some and shared it with the next person. And they said, "Leide, are you going to try? This drug can help you relax, it can help you feel fine, it can help you forget your worries." And I was able to tell them and take this opportunity to share and say that actually it's not a cigarette and it's not marijuana or drugs that will help you find happiness or relax or forget anxiety. At this time, marijuana wasn't legal in this place. But the deeper message wasn't about something legal or illegal. It was about thinking or finding harmony and peace in something outside of ourselves, something material rather than spiritual. At that moment for me, it was about expressing the dominion from God that leads to making right decisions, and sharing this small moment with the people surrounding me. Maybe this seems like a small, tiny decision or something silly, but this same feeling of dominion, of God's divine law, that helped me in that moment make a right decision, is also at work in the same minds of the people surrounding us and making decisions, in the lawmakers and the politicians. The same dominion of divine law that is behind the ability to make correct decisions that share love instead of tragedy. That same principle is present today, just as it was then. If we want a society that is more fair, that is more healthy, more emotionally healthy, more mentally healthy, what we need to do is to pray, to connect back with this divine law. And as we do that, we can know that it's divine love and divine love's law that corrects any inadequate decision. Christian Science has helped me personally, and it can help many others. It can help every single person around us. It can help us not to feel like a victim. And if we think about especially the feeling of the recent massacres, and this feeling of being a victim or being helpless to the actions of others, if we think about the family members and the people who lost loved ones in El Paso and Texas and Ohio, we can also think that the very first source of help is God, and God's love that is there ever present and unconditionally with the family members who are feeling a loss, as well as with the perpetrators of these events. And that divine love, divine law is guiding and telling and putting limits and telling people when to say no and when to change their decisions. I want to give another example. So after I finished my studies in London, after a few years later, I decided to move to Germany. And after a few months of being there, I didn't speak any German. And I started to feel alone and separate from the others that were surrounding me in my language school. And suddenly, I heard from some classmates that there was also a feeling of fear and isolation that started to come up within the school. There was some worry about finances and some worry about things that were going on in the world. And the people in my school that were surrounding me also started to feel fear and anxiety. And at that moment, I wondered what to do. And then I realized, Leide, why don't you pray? Why don't we turn to the source of divine mind that's helped you in so many other times in your life? And I remember the story of Potiphar and Joseph, who had a strong faith in God and was trustworthy. And this is also a story of an immigrant who I could relate to as someone who'd moved to Germany and London from my native Brazil. And I read the story of Joseph again for inspiration, the son of Jacob. So when Joseph was sold as a slave to Potiphar, who was an officer of the Egyptian pharaoh, soon Potiphar was entrusted with all that he had. Soon Potiphar entrusted Joseph with all that he had. And Joseph had a very strong faith in God and was trustworthy. But one day, when Potiphar was not at home, his wife told Joseph, holding onto his clothes, "Lie with me." And Joseph refused and ran away. Can you imagine how furious this woman must have become? Joseph was just a slave. But he was honest. He was just. No matter his social position, he stood up to her. And he made a decision in that moment. So when Potiphar came back, his wife told him her version of the story and said that Joseph wanted to sleep with her. And Potiphar sent Joseph to prison. Of course, he was angry and he believed his wife. And Joseph was completely innocent, but he had no way to prove his innocence. And he remained for 2 whole years in prison. But he continued to be faithful and help others even while he was in jail. So, sometime later, the Pharaoh had a dream and wanted someone to interpret it. But nobody could. And then somebody suggested that Joseph could interpret the dream. So the Pharaoh called for Joseph, who had a great spiritual sense that enabled him to interpret the dream, and that also was made evident to everyone around him, even though he was enslaved and even though he was imprisoned. And so he interpreted the dream with a spiritual sense, and the Pharaoh immediately saw the great spirituality and spiritual skill that was inside Joseph. and he returned to him his dignity and his freedom. So, in the audience, you might be thinking, what does this story have to do with my life? What does it have to do with the decisions that I make in my everyday life? Well, I thought in that moment when I was in Germany and revisiting this story, I thought this story has to do with making decisions that are not based on fear. Joseph could have been afraid, he might have ran away, but he didn't. He returned to God, his spiritual origin, and he faced the problem. He even stayed faithful to this divine mind and this presence, this spiritual sense, even while in jail. And I realized that looking at that example, I needed to confront my situation in Germany mentally and overcome the fear of failure and guilt. I was in this country where I felt isolated, I felt alone, I wasn't sure of my ability to remain there, and I saw this feeling reflected in my classmates and the school around me. What I learned is that I needed, just like everyone else did in my community, to develop my spiritual sense. Because our spiritual sense is our source of our constant comfort in knowing that divine mind and divine law is always present, even if it appears that it's not. So, what's the manifestation of God? It's Christ. The Christ understanding enabled Jesus to see God's creation. And just as Jesus saw us as God's creation and reflection, the Christ Spirit also enables us to purify our eyes and our hearts. It enables us to transform our lives through healing. I learned this in my life then in Germany. I also learned this when I had to leave. I was in the visa process and I had to return home. I also learned this with the woman who was pregnant and her child who was born healthy after all the doctors said that she wouldn't live. This is the same principle, the healing principle of Christian Science. This is not just positive thinking, it's not New Age thinking or Scientology. It's something totally different. Christian Science doesn't prohibit, doesn't judge. Christian Science doesn't condemn anyone. On the contrary, it frees us to experience true healing. Healings, just like the baby who was born perfect and whole. Healings like the ones I experienced in Germany when I realized my own capacity for success as a reflection of divine mind. All of these examples are talking about healing any kind of loss that we have of our spiritual sense. I also want to return here to the idea of the news. Reading positive news is very important, just as important as reading the terrible news that we see around us every day. So, we've heard this concept of fake news. It's not something that's invented or new. Even in Mary Baker Eddy's time, decades ago, fake news was around. Even in the 1800s. For example, Mary Baker Eddy was one of the most famous women in the United States. She was able to found a church with thousands of members and hundreds of branches all across the nation. But sometimes for reasons of envy or negative thinking, she was the victim also of fake news. There was many false stories that were published about her work and her mission, even about her followers. And she had to face this concept in her day. So, she developed the Christian Science Monitor, a newspaper that doesn't see only the negative, that doesn't condemn, but on the contrary, sees the spiritual and the true divine mind that's reflected in all of the news around the world. In this newspaper, the journalists who write for this paper help us to see those truths. They help us to see the good that's also present surrounding us. I hope you can see this slide that's behind me. We have a whole range of newspapers here on this slide. On one side there's neutral, and the other side, there's one side is liberal, the other side is conservative. And we can see the Christian Science Monitor is right in the middle. Sharing the truths from a realistic but also positive perspective. The side of the news where we can read the divine truths that are ever present, even in our daily lives, even in daily lives that appear to be full of tragedy. So, in summary, a few of the things we've talked about today all revolve around spiritual sense and how each one of us can develop this spiritual sense within us. The spiritual sense comes from an understanding of the spiritual law that Jesus saw, the spiritual law of supply and demand. Just like we saw the example of Peter, who found the coin in the fish's mouth to pay taxes. And we also saw other examples of Jesus showing people how to forgive and how to heal through forgiveness. We saw the example of Jacob's interpretation of the Pharaoh's dream and his faith that eventually led him back to freedom. And we also saw the spiritual sense developed in the healings of Mary Baker Eddy and her spiritual science of Christianity. And now I would like to invite each one of you to realize that it's our turn to develop our own spiritual sense. The more that we develop this sense, the more love we're able to develop and express. The more love we're able to express and convey to our friends, our family members, the people we see in the street, the people we see on the screen in the news. The more we're able to express an unconditional love, the spiritual love that we read about in the Bible. And this is exactly what will lead us to a society and a world that is more loving and safer. When we love and feel deeply this love, we feel protected from any error or any news. Thank you so much to everyone for coming tonight. I'm so happy to have been here with you. If anyone has a question, please approach me afterwards and take with you a card that reminds you of your own spiritual identity. Thank you so much. Thank you.